Is claiming a tremendous victory today after Supreme Court justices ruled to uphold his controversial travel ban. In a 5-4 vote along partisan lines, the justices decided the president has the right to limit entry of people to the U.S. from 7 countries, most of them predominantly Muslim. They include Syria, Libya, Iran, Yemen, Somalia, North Korea, and some people from Venezuela. Justices Sotomayor, Ginsburg, Kagan, and Breyer voted against the ban, while Justices Roberts, Kennedy, Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch voted to uphold it. President Trump took to Twitter shortly after the ruling came down with a simple "wow!" exclamation point. The Supreme Court's decision overturns a lower court ruling against the ban. CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford has the latest.
Well, this is the first major legal test of the Trump presidency in this 5-4 decision today, written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Supreme Court has really delivered him a major victory, saying that his third attempt to pass a travel ban finally would pass constitutional scrutiny. Now, I don't think this decision was a surprise. The Supreme Court back in December allowed the travel ban to take effect while the appeals kind of played out, which was a signal that they were probably going to uphold it today. Trump passed this travel ban back in September. It was his, as I said, his third attempt. The first 2 were blocked almost completely by the lower courts. He had lost at almost every turn. And so today, the Supreme Court said that the third time was a charm, that he had finally gotten it right, that presidents were entitled to deference on these kind of questions of national security and protecting our borders here, and that this ban passed that kind of muster and that kind of review. There were 4 dissenting justices. The liberal justices wrote very sharp dissents, saying that the court had really failed to consider the discriminatory impact on Muslims, that this was in fact a Muslim ban. But the administration had always said it was not a Muslim ban. They'd argued this when the Supreme Court heard arguments in the case last month, or back in April, that this was not a Muslim ban. It was 5 mostly Muslim countries at this point. It excluded the vast majority of the Muslim world. And today, the Supreme Court in this 5-4 decision agreed that this was a legitimate and reasonable exercise of the president's authority. Adriana?
Jan Crawford, thanks. The Trump administration is calling today's court decision on the president's travel ban, quote, profound vindication. The White House released a statement from the president which reads, today's Supreme Court ruling is a tremendous victory for the American people and the Constitution. The Supreme Court has upheld the clear authority of the president to defend the national security of the United States. In this era of worldwide terrorism and extremist movements bent on harming innocent civilians, we must properly vet those coming into our country. I want to bring in Jordan Fabian. He is a White House correspondent for The Hill.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Before we do that, let's listen to the president.
Seen, otherwise you wouldn't be at the top of your game. The fact that today's Supreme Court ruling just coming out, a tremendous success, a tremendous victory for the American people and for our Constitution. This is a great victory for our Constitution. We have to be tough, and we have to be safe, and we have to be secure. At a minimum, we have to make sure that we vet people coming into the country. We know who's coming in. We know where they're coming from. We just have to know who's coming here. The ruling shows that all of the attacks from the media and the Democrat politicians are wrong, and they turned out to be very wrong. And what we're looking for as Republicans, I can tell you, is strong borders, no crime. What the Democrats are looking at is open borders, which will bring tremendous crime. It'll bring MS-13 and lots of others that we don't want to have in our country. It'll bring tremendous crime. So I will always be defending the sovereignty, the safety, and the security of the American people. That's why I was put here. We're discussing today the funding of the wall, which we very much need. We've started the wall. We're spending a lot of energy and a lot of time, and it started up in San Diego and other places. It's under construction now. We have $1.6 billion. But we're going to ask for an increase in wall spending so we can finish it quicker. It stops the drugs. It stops people that we don't want to have. And it gives us security and safety. And with that, I think we might just take a quick spin around the room, talk to a couple of the folks. And maybe, Senator, I'll ask you, Roy, do you want to say a couple of words about why we're here and what we're doing.
Well, I think with the leadership of Chairman Freeland-Heisen and Chairman Shelby, we're actually trying to get these appropriations bills to the floor and get them on your desk, as you've insisted, not in an omnibus. I think the last time we had a conference report on the Senate floor, this would be where the House passed a bill and we did, and we went to was 2011. So we just passed the first 3 bills yesterday that the House had already passed, and we're doing our best to try to get back into business in a transparent way so that people can see what their government's doing.
Good. Thank you. Yes.
We're in the first quarter of the appropriation process, if you want to use the football analogy. We're doing well right now. We're working together. I think both sides.
We were just listening in to the president discuss what he calls a tremendous victory in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court justices supporting his travel ban. We want to bring in Jordan Fabian. He's a White House correspondent for The Hill. Jordan, the president called this decision vindication, but this was the 3rd draft of his travel ban. The first 2, of course, as we all remember from the protests, didn't go so well. So would you really call this a decisive victory for the administration?
Well, I think it's a victory in the sense now they can carry out this policy. And what that statement, vindication, indicates is the president has been extremely frustrated with the legal system, especially when it comes to the immigration issue. He expressed that frustration time and time again, as we heard after the Supreme Court lower courts struck down that original travel ban. For months, we've heard him rail against how the legal system is holding his immigration agenda back. Now the Supreme Court has given him the go-ahead to implement this travel ban, which is really the centerpiece of his immigration agenda. So indeed a victory today for the president.
The first version of the ban, as you remember, was met with massive protests and confusion over how to implement it. What does this decision say about how the administration can successfully move forward on policy?
Well, I think the signal the court is sending is the administration needs to be more careful. The reason that first order was struck down is it didn't really go through any kind of process, and it was overly broad, and the courts responded by striking it down before it could go under a legal review. They went back to the drawing board. They crafted something that includes some carve-outs, includes some exceptions. They included countries like North Korea that's not predominantly Muslim, so they could try to claim that it's not really a Muslim ban. So that might be a sign to this administration going forward to be more careful. I mean, look at the family separation policy going on right now. They're having some issues with that, and that was another sort of hastily drafted order they came out with. And again, it might be a clue to the decision makers to be a little more careful.
To plan out these policies with more detail so that they don't end up being opposed by the courts, end up getting to the Supreme Court and going through this long process. Now, in terms of the president's remarks today, he said that what he is pushing for is strong borders, no crime, and Democrats want open borders and tremendous crime. What's your opinion on that assertion?
Well, I think what we're seeing is the president emboldened by this court ruling, even though, again, he had these legal problems in the past. The president is pushing forward on 2 things right now. The zero tolerance policy, which has resulted in these child separations. You have to wonder if he's going to be more strongly pushing that going forward after signing that executive order last week to stop some of the separation, and also funding for his border wall. This is going to be a major funding fight when the government funding runs out in September. The president has demanded funding be in that package, or else he threatened that he might shut down the government. So the president now seeing that the court is on his side on one key immigration issue, you have to wonder if he's going to push forward even more strongly on other elements of that in the weeks and months ahead.
On immigration, the Health and Human Services Secretary says his department still has more than 2,000 immigrant children separated from their parents in their custody. And that's as a result of the zero tolerance policy. So what is the administration saying about how they're going to reunite them as of now?
There's still a lack of clarity on how these reunifications are taking place. We know for some of them they've been able to find their parents, but we've heard many cases from the border where children are taken into custody and the records don't indicate who their parents are, but if they do, maybe not where they are. So there's a lot of problems right now logistically trying to reunite these parents, and the administration hasn't really put forward any kind of policy or push to reunite these children. So while this issue is sort of faded into into the background with the Supreme Court decision now coming out on the travel ban, it's still going to be a major challenge for this administration to fix the mess it created.
How do you think that the Supreme Court's decision on the travel ban will affect the policy on immigration? What kind of pressure or signal does that give the administration?
Well, the majority of conservative justices handed this president a major victory when it said the president has wide latitude under executive power to enforce immigration law. So this has been a central argument of the president's hardline stance. Does he have the power to do things like split up families, ban people from certain Muslim majority countries? And the court said he does. So that broad statement from the court could embolden the president to take even more aggressive action going forward.
Jordan, thank you so much for those insights. Let's turn now to our chief congressional correspondent, Nancy Cordes, who's on the Hill for us. Nancy, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Good to talk to you, Adriana.
Good to talk to you, too. What's been the reaction from lawmakers on the Supreme Court ruling?
Well, it's been coming down predictably along party lines. Democrats outraged. They are saying that this is a victory for those who would discriminate on racial and religious grounds. Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, said that this ruling doesn't make us safer. The travel ban doesn't make us safer, and the ruling doesn't make it right. Republicans, on the other hand, said, hey, look, 3 times a charm, that the travel ban that went before the Supreme Court was within the bounds of the law. Obviously, the Justice Department had to tweak it to get it there, but they argue that the president had a right to do what he felt would keep the country safe. And there's even a little bit of gloating going on from the Republican leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell. It was McConnell, of course, who held up not just a vote, but a hearing on President Obama's pick for Supreme Court for nearly a year, Merrick Garland. And so today, after that ruling came down, his campaign fund, Team Mitch, tweeted out a photo of McConnell shaking Garland's hand, Neil Gorsuch's hand, rather. No caption, but simply a reminder that it is thanks to McConnell in large part that we saw this 5-4 ruling today. We've seen a little bit of unease from a very small sliver of Republicans, Adriana, who say that, that though the administration was able to finally get this past the Supreme Court, that the president's intent clearly differed from the final product, that he had made multiple statements indicating that he wanted to keep Muslims out of this country. But by and large, you're hearing, at least officially, a lot of relief from the Republican Party today.
And Nancy, we heard from Senator Richard Blumenthal earlier today. Let's play some of his response.
Clearly, this opinion is by no means the end of this story. It is no solution. There is no question there has to be legislation to protect our essential liberties, our image around the world, which is very much at risk and at stake here. The Congress now has work to do. It cannot simply allow the courts to determine, or the president, what our future is in this area. There now needs to be legislation.
So, Nancy, the senator is suggesting Congress will need to get involved, but how much can they change this, and how realistic would that be?
As of right now, Adriana, there doesn't seem to be a huge appetite to change the law in this area or in the area of gerrymandering, which is something else that came up before that the Supreme Court ruled on earlier this week. And so, it seems unlikely, with Congress unable even to pass a comprehensive immigration reform plan that the president claims to support, the likelihood that they'd be able to pass something that goes against what he's trying to do in this arena is pretty unlikely, especially in an election year.
Nancy Cordes, thank you so much. An Occupy ICE movement has spread across the country from New York to Portland, calling for a change in the Trump administration's policies. The protesters have set up camp outside several offices of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, including the headquarters seen here in Detroit, Michigan, which they temporarily shut down on Monday. Protesters say the eventual goal is to shut down ICE completely and to end what they call, quote, inhumane and immoral treatment of immigrant families. ICE was first created in 2003. We're learning new details now about the government detention centers that are housing undocumented children. Government handout video shows inside so-called tent cities in Tornillo, Texas. There's more than 300 undocumented teens here. It costs about $700 a day per child to care for them. Our Mireya Villarreal toured the facility yesterday. She's near the border in El Paso, just northwest of Tornillo.
A la cárcel. Okay, a la cárcel. First they took her son, then they took her to jail.
Edis tells us she was separated from her 6-year-old son after they crossed the border. She believes he's in Arizona.
She says she's tried several times to try and talk to her son, and that has not happened.
Edis was released from a detention center and is one of 32 immigrant parents staying at the Annunciation House in El Paso.
The average length of this time that the parents have been in detention was 25 days.
Taylor Levy is the legal coordinator of Annunciation House.
91% of the families, the parents who we spoke to, have not personally spoken to their children since being separated.
We toured a tent city in Tornillo, Texas, Monday, where 326 teenagers are being housed. Our cameras were not allowed inside, but the government provided this video. We learned children spend their day on a regimented military-style schedule. They eat 3 meals a day and are given 2 snacks. Many of them spend their free time playing soccer. The Tornillo facility has been open for nearly 2 weeks, and in that time, the Department of Health and Human Services tells us 70 children have been released to family or sponsors.
We've established where the parents are almost immediately when the child comes into our care.
Mark Weber is with HHS.
Overall, these kids are connected with their parents.
But Annunciation House Director Ruben Garcia disagrees.
I have 32 parents here that will say to him that is categorically untrue.
Federal authorities dismissed the criminal charges against that entire group of 32, although they still have their immigration cases pending. The incident commander at the tent city in Tornillo says that this facility was built specifically because of the separation policy. He calls it a dumb, stupid decision that should have never been made. Mireya Villarreal, CBS News, El Paso, Texas.
Coming up after the break, a deep dive into a red state, what's at play in Mississippi in this year's midterms. And a scientist is murdered while on a camping trip. Is it a pattern? You're streaming CBSN.
A Supreme Court ruling just coming out, a tremendous success, a tremendous victory for the American people and for our Constitution. This is a great victory for our Constitution. We have to be tough, and we have to be safe, and we have to be secure. At a minimum, we have to make sure that we vet people coming into the country. We know who's coming in. We know where they're coming from. We just have to know who's coming here. The ruling shows that all of the attacks from the media and the Democrat politicians are wrong, and they turned out to be very wrong.
That was President Trump reacting to the ruling handed down by the Supreme Court that upholds his travel ban on 7 countries. They include Syria, Libya, Iran, Yemen, Somalia, North Korea, and Venezuela. For more, let's bring in Ilya Shapiro from Washington. He's a senior fellow in constitutional studies at the Cato Institute. Ilya, were you surprised by this decision, and what was your major takeaway from the ruling?
I wasn't surprised that the justices let the travel ban 3.0 stay in place. That was the conventional wisdom based on their having let it go into effect in December and having let most of the second one go into effect a year ago. There was a bit of a surprise that it was a 5-4 kind of vehement disagreement. I was expecting something more narrow that would garner more votes. But regardless, the effect is the same, both because of the great discretion that the immigration law gives to the president, the provisions to restrict entry to certain classes of aliens based on national security considerations, and then the deference that courts give on constitutional and other questions when the president, when the executive branch is exercising its national security prerogative. So I think that was pretty much a foregone conclusion. What the court effectively is saying that any president, including this one, the same rules apply, and we as a court are not going to second guess that. We're not going to balance the evidence presented and make a different policy judgment, but just based on the normal standards that apply, the reasons for the restrictions as presented on the face of the proclamation, as it was called, are legitimate, and that's the end of it. And if Congress wants to change the statutory balance of power, they're free to do that, but courts are going to defer, and the current statute is very broad.
So the opinion handed down by the court says that the order is, quote, squarely within the scope of presidential authority. How does this then define how much unilateral power the president has?
Well, the court goes statute by statute, an area of law to area of law. So this does not necessarily have any effect on President Trump and what he's doing with the Mueller investigation or anything else, or any other type of executive action. The court looked at the text of the relevant immigration statute, which the dissenting justices, the majority points out, don't even grapple with in their opinions, and found that Congress gives very broad, not unreviewable by courts, but very broad authority to the president. And moreover, all of President Trump's or candidate Trump's tweets and other statements, the controversial, fiery rhetoric and whatnot, they looked at that, but then they saw there were legitimate justifications as well, and carve-outs of which countries, and if you have a legitimate reason to come to America and things like this. They weighed all of that, and they said, look, we're not going to overturn the president on national security based on these speculative assertions of his not having a good enough policy reason. So yeah, in this one area, in terms of restricting entry to the country, the court has said the president has broad power. Anything else, that's a separate case.
Now, just speaking about the justices in particular, Neil Gorsuch has been praised by Republicans for his role in the ruling. We saw that photo of the handshake, just to praise that. There have been rumors for months that Chief Justice Kennedy may retire. So what's at stake for that next vacancy?
Well, we could, 24 hours from now, we may be talking about the legacy of Justice Kennedy and the battle for his successor. Tomorrow is the next and last day that the court is handing down opinions. Or we might hear in the middle of the summer. He might send a telegram from Salzburg saying that. So yeah, the court is currently poised, as we've seen, 5-4. Both cases decided today, the travel ban and also a First Amendment case regarding a California law with abortion clinics, what they have to say or don't have to say. So that next justice is going to be pivotal. If President Trump or another Republican president is allowed to confirm his nominee, then Chief Justice Roberts effectively becomes the majority of the court. The court's balance shifts right in many ways. If, on the other hand, nobody is confirmed, or the Democrats take the Senate and there's that vacancy remains, then that will have a significant difference as well. So judicial nominations mean things. We learned that in the 2016 election, where where it's possible that Donald Trump would not have won without the Scalia vacancy crystallizing the issue for many voters. So that is definitely going to be a big campaign issue in November, whether a new justice will have been confirmed or not by then.
We'll have to wait and see. Ilya Shapiro, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Voters in 7 states are heading to the polls today. Colorado, Maryland, New York, Oklahoma, and Utah have their primaries. Mississippi and South Carolina are holding runoff elections. For Campaign 28 Local Matters 2018, Local Matters, we're taking a closer look at Mississippi. Voters there are deciding who will be on the ballot for this November for House and Senate races. Mississippi Democrats are choosing between a party stalwart and a newcomer for the nomination to the U.S. Senate. State House Minority Leader David Berea and venture capitalist Howard Sherman finished first and second in a 6-candidate June 5th primary. 2 Republicans are battling to represent the state's 3rd congressional district. That race is between District Attorney Michael Guest and business consultant Whit Hughes. Bobby Harrison is the senior Capitol reporter for Mississippi Today. He joins me now from Jackson, Mississippi. Bobby, let's start with the Senate race. Give us some background on both Berea and Sherman.
Well, as you said, Berea is the state House Democratic leader. He's a 3rd-term legislator. He's been sort of a solid voice for the Democrats in the legislature. And Howard Sherman is the venture capitalist who sort of made his money in Los Angeles, which is where he's from California. But he's also the husband of Mississippi actress Sheila Ward, who is a Emmy Award-winning actress and well thought of in the state. And they now live in Meridian, Mississippi, and he's come back and opted to run for this Senate seat, and it's turned into quite a battle between Sherman and Berea. They both run a spirited campaign. Berea's gotten the endorsements of most of the Democratic elected officials in the state, not all of them, but most of them. And Sherman's kind of depended a lot on his own deep pockets to finance his race, and he's done better than a lot of people expected. You know, his money makes a big difference in Mississippi Democratic politics because traditionally, over the past several elections, Democrats in Mississippi have had a hard time have had a hard time raising money for their campaigns. So Sherman's put about $850,000 at least of his own money into the campaign. That's made a huge difference.
Now, it was such a close race in the primaries. They were each within about 1% of each other on June 5th. So who do you think might come out ahead today, and how much does it really matter in November?
Well, those are both good questions. And the first question, it's so much. The turnout was real low, and the vote was so close. It depends on which candidate is able to get his voters back to the polls today. There's this train of school of thought that Berea, who has deep roots in the Democratic Party of Mississippi, his voters more likely to come back to the polls for a runoff. But Sherman, as I said, has run a spirited campaign and has worked real hard. So it's anybody's guess. I think I won't be surprised either way. Now, as far as November, Roger Wicker is a Republican incumbent. He's considered a heavy favorite to win re-election, and is expected to win by a comfortable margin. But this is an interesting race, and both Berea and Sherman are running legitimate campaigns, which doesn't always occur, in Mississippi when there's a strong Republican incumbent already in office. They're running legitimate campaigns, and they're running as true Democrats. They're not trying to run necessarily to the middle. They're not running as way out to the left, but they're running as true Democrats. They both criticize President Trump, which is unusual in Mississippi politics. Berea talks about raising the minimum wage. So they're running true Democratic campaigns, which, as I said, is not always the case in Democratic primaries in Mississippi. There's a tendency to try to run towards the middle. So I guess they're viewing that there's a Democratic base out there that they can tap into that would not only help them today, but maybe even carry them in November in the general election.
Do you think either of them really stand a chance in such a red state? And how pivotal is this seat in the Senate? It's
considered a safe Republican seat. So, if either one of them, if the winner today won in November, it would be the biggest political upset. And I've been covering Mississippi politics for a long time, and it'd be the biggest political upset I've seen. It did occur, but there's a few wild cards in play that could make a difference. First of all, while President Trump's popular in Mississippi, there is some resentment toward him, and it's pretty pretty enthusiastic, that resentment. And there's also a special Senate election on that same day. Thad Cochran, who is other U.S. Senator, resigned earlier this year for health reasons. So there's going to be a special election to replace him. And that election is getting a lot of attention because Mike Espy is running as a Democrat. He was the first black elected to Congress from Mississippi since Reconstruction. And he's also was the Ag Secretary in the Clinton administration. And some people think he can energize a sizable African-American voting base and make that election and the special election as well as the Wicker election closer than it might normally be.
Well, we'll see if there's any kind of signs for an upset. Bobby Harrison, thank you so much. Coming up after the break, CBS News anchor Jeff Glor talks with voters in California about civility and the morality of the president's actions on immigration. And some Harley-Davidson hogs will be manufactured in Europe because of the president's trade policies. Now he's threatening with new taxes. Details ahead. You're streaming CBSN.
Used it as an excuse, and I think the people that ride Harleys are not happy with Harley-Davidson, and I wouldn't be either. But mostly companies are coming back to our country. I was the one that explained to Harley about 100% tax in India, where they had a tariff of 100%, and I got it down to a much lower number. I think it's 50%, which is far too much, but they were paying 100% tariff. Now, Prime Minister Modi brought it way down, but it's still way too high. No, I will say this, John. Other countries are negotiating. And without tariffs, you could never do that. And if they don't want to negotiate, then we'll do the tariffs. And just remember, we're the bank. We're the bank that everybody wants to steal from.
That was President Donald Trump today reacting to Harley-Davidson's decision to move some of its production overseas. The reason? The EU's retaliatory tariffs after the president imposed tariffs on aluminum and steel imports. For more, we turn to the Washington Post's financial writer covering trade and globalization, David Lynch. David, thanks for joining us. After threatening allies at a contentious G7 summit, President Trump now seems to be causing more controversy by threatening American companies like Harley-Davidson with taxes. What do you think is the overall end game for the White House with this approach?
Well, it's probably anyone's guess, but there's two possible outcomes. Either these tariffs give the president the leverage that he's seeking to have a negotiation with Europe and presumably reduce trade barriers across the board, or they stay in place and we're on our way to a tit-for-tat trade war.
Now, the president said that what he's doing here is taking an America First approach to trade, but Harley-Davidson is still planning on sending a portion of its production overseas. So does the Harley move show that the president's trade approach is backfiring?
Well, it certainly shows that there are costs associated with it. You know, a trade war is like any other war. The other side gets to shoot back. And when the president put these steel and aluminum tariffs in place, the European Union said they would retaliate. They have now retaliated, and that means manufacturers that want to ship products to Europe, like Harley-Davidson, face higher tariffs. That reduces demand for their products in Europe, and that's an obvious problem for them. And now Harley is doing pretty much what you'd expect a company to do. They're trying to find a more effective and cost-effective way of getting their product into the hand of their customers. And in this case, that means not making it in the United States anymore, but making it overseas.
So the EU's taxes weren't just placed on companies like Harley-Davidson, based out of Wisconsin, of course, but also bourbon based in Kentucky and tobacco in North Carolina. Do you think the European tariffs are strategically targeting politically important states to the Trump administration?
There's no question that that's the case, as is the case with the trade conflict going on with China. Our U.S. trading partners recognize that the way to bring pressure to bear in the U.S. system is to cause companies and their workers pain in politically important states. The hope on the part of the trading partners is that those companies complain to their elected representatives, and they in turn go to the president and say, look, you're going to kill us in the fall in the midterm elections unless you back off from some of these tariffs. And that's certainly the message that many of the Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill have been delivering to the White House privately.
So if this is indeed a trade war, as you say, is this a sign that the EU may have an edge on the United States, and will other companies follow suit?
Well, other companies are certainly going to feel the same effects that Harley-Davidson is feeling. Whether the EU has an edge or not, I don't know. I mean, what many trade experts say about these sort of commercial conflicts is that there's really no winner, that both sides in a trade war end up worse off, and that may be where we're headed.
David Lynch, thank you so much. In a 5-4 ruling today along partisan lines, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld President Donald Trump's travel ban on several predominantly Muslim countries. The ban limits the number of visas granted to travelers from 5 predominantly Muslim countries: Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and also adds restrictions to people in North Korea and Venezuela. This is the third version of the administration's travel ban. The ruling reverses a series of lower court decisions that have previously been struck down. The ban struck down the ban as illegal and unconstitutional for the last 15 months. Chief Justice Roberts supported the court's other 4 conservatives. In an issued opinion, he wrote the proclamation is within the, quote, scope of presidential authority. Today, President Trump applauded that decision with a lunch with congressional lawmakers.
Today's Supreme Court ruling just coming out, a tremendous success, a tremendous victory for the American people and for our Constitution. This is a great victory for our Constitution. We have to be tough, and we have to be safe, and we have to be secure. At a minimum, we have to make sure that we vet people coming into the country. We know who's coming in. We know where they're coming from.
CBS News Washington correspondent Paula Reeds joins us now from the White House. Paula, this was a huge win for the president. Could the Supreme Court decision encourage President Trump and his administration to take even more aggressive moves to cut down on travel from more majority Muslim countries?
Well, you're right. This was a huge win. This was his first big victory at the Supreme Court, his first big legal challenge at the Supreme Court, and he won. So this was a rare day here at the White House where he gets to do a little bit of a victory lap, because here Chief Justice John Roberts, he upheld a very expansive definition of the president's authority to decide who comes in and out of this country. And yes, there is a possibility that he could add additional Muslim countries going forward. But the more immediate question is whether or not this will embolden the president on immigration. As we heard right there when he was meeting with congressional leaders, he reiterated his need to control who comes in and out of this country for national security. So the fact that the Supreme Court has handed him a victory here and validated this broad scope of his presidential authority on national security, we would expect this may embolden him in terms of his language and policy on the immigration issue.
We'll have to see how this really affects his approach with the immigration issue that's unfolding right now at the border. Now, in terms of the travel ban, this was the third version of the travel ban, and the Trump administration argued this version would be different and was considered a watered-down version of the original plan. How different was it really, and what were the important points that you think allowed the Supreme Court to uphold it?
Well, it's incredibly different. It's unlikely that the first travel ban that was issued just in his first few days in office, that really would have passed muster at the Supreme Court. I remember the day that was passed, we called the Department of Homeland Security. They had no idea what was coming. They had no idea how they were going to implement it. That first travel ban, it had no exceptions for any sort of unique circumstances. It did appear to be sort of a blanket Muslim ban with no forward-thinking logistical coordination across administrations. For the second travel ban, the administration was a little more fully formed. At that point, he had a Department of Homeland Security chief, he had an attorney general, and they helped advise him based on things that judges had specifically said was wrong with the first one. Then they did another iteration before the second one got all the way to the Supreme Court, and it does seem to be a more fully realized version of this policy. There were surveys that they did with foreign governments to really vet each country in terms of whether or not those countries were actually providing accurate information about their citizens who are coming here. And they made a decision to include this group of countries, and it wasn't just predominantly Muslim countries. They obviously additionally added North Korea and Venezuela, so it seemed less like a quote-unquote Muslim ban that was knocked down in the previous versions and more like a national security policy.
I wonder how that ban on certain North Korean officials will affect this now moving forward, as things have been getting a little bit less tense between the U.S. and North Korea. But focusing on the border and the wall, President Trump said he will ask Congress for increased funding for the wall. How do you think this ruling will affect his efforts to receive that funding?
Well, it was interesting watching these congressional leaders who came here to the White House today. Many of them were hoping to get some answers on whether or not the president really does support the GOP compromise on immigration. And the first time the president mentioned immigration after taking a victory lap about the Supreme Court was to talk about funding for the border wall and how he continues to believe that that is essential to ensuring security at the border. He believes that wall would prevent people from coming here and also bringing drugs and other things here. He believes that really is the solution, and any sort of legislative compromise, he wants to make sure that he's not only getting the funding allocated, but it's actually authorized. And that was a key difference in the two GOP proposals on immigration. The more hardline approach that we thought a lot of the president's supporters would really like. The problem with that is that the president wasn't guaranteed funding for a border wall. Now, the GOP compromise bill, that will give him the money for his border wall. But at this point, Adriana, it doesn't appear that that's actually going to have sufficient support to pass. In fact, the president just last week tweeted that they shouldn't even bother with it until they have an enormous red wave. He describes it a victory in the midterm elections to ensure that they have enough votes so he can get everything that he wants on immigration, including money for that border wall.
Paula Rito is breaking it down for us. Thank you so much. CBS Evening News anchor Jeff Glor spoke with a group of voters in California to discuss our divisive political climate and whether people have gotten meaner since the president took office.
It seems like there's less civility right now.
Yeah.
All the way around.
There's no
It's
compassion.
appalling. It's absolutely appalling. Yeah. I'm very upset with the hate that is going on.
Yeah.
And in particular, people who work for the government and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, you know, being led out of the restaurant and not served because of who she works for. I don't think that's right.
If it was my restaurant, I wouldn't serve that person.
Well,
you wouldn't serve?
No.
I've seen Miss Huckabee do her
press conferences, and the way she talked to some of those reporters is like totally disrespectful. So when you go out, you're gonna feel that. Somebody is gonna say something to you because you've offended the people that are watching you.
You know, I think it's just indicative of really a larger problem with our discourse. We've got, when I watch the news, for example, I feel like I'm told every day that I'm a racist, I'm a bigot, I'm a homophobe, because I just believe in slightly different things. I think at the end of the day, really all of us want the same thing. I just disagree on execution. And I think that when we're seeing all the things with Sarah Huckabee Sanders being kicked out of a restaurant, what Maxine Waters is saying, we're all looking at each other as members of parties rather than as human beings.
Let me go around the table quickly. Would you ask her to leave?
No.
Nope.
Yes.
No.
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 A soldier from Kentucky will be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor today for his actions during World War II. First Lieutenant Garland Connor, who died in 1998 at the age of 79, will be celebrated as one of the most decorated soldiers in U.S. history. He's already been given the Distinguished Service Cross, 4 Silver Star medals, 1 Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts for injuries suffered in combat between 1942 and 1945. His widow, Pauline Connor, will accept the medal at the White House on her husband's behalf. You can watch the full honor ceremony right here on CBSN at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. The Pawnee Fire in Lake County, California continues to burn. Firefighters braved 100-foot-tall flames that raced up a canyon to save more than a dozen homes. California Governor Jerry Brown has declared a state of emergency. Currently, there are 1,400 firefighters from across Northern California battling the wildfires. Long Beach police have charged 77-year-old Thomas Kim with the death of a fire captain who responded to a call at a retirement facility. Captain Dave Rosa was shot on Monday while responding to reports of an explosion at a senior living facility. Investigators believe Kim set a fire at his home to lure firefighters there in order to shoot them. The search continues for 12 boys and their soccer coach who've been missing for 3 days in Thailand. Rescuers are racing to pump water out of a 6-mile-long flooded cave where the team is believed to be trapped. Tina Kraus has the latest on the search.
Thailand's Navy SEALs have joined the search for a team of young soccer players who went into this cave with their coach after a weekend match. Monsoon rains fell and swamped the underground tunnel, trapping the boys inside. Authorities say divers are rushing to pump out muddy water that has filled some chambers of the cave to the ceiling. Search teams have found holes at the top of the cave, which means the boys aged 11 to 16 could be getting some air. Their bikes and backpacks are still waiting for them at the entrance, along with their distraught parents. Mothers begged their sons to come out, shouting, "We're waiting for you." Officials are hopeful the boys found a safe space away from the floods in the 6-mile-long cave. This relative says the soccer coach is strong and healthy and will lead the kids to safety. As rescue teams searched for a 4th night, parents prayed and performed traditional rituals at the site, using fishing nets as a symbolic way to bring back lost spirits from the cave. Tina Kraus, CBS News.
Prince William is in Israel today for the first official visit by a British royal to the country in nearly 70 years. William toured Jerusalem's Holocaust Memorial and met survivors who escaped Nazi Germany by going to Britain. The memorial recognizes William's great-grandmother, Princess Alice, for helping Jewish people during the Holocaust. The prince also met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his wife, and he's set to meet with Palestinian leaders tomorrow. But the trip is billed as non-political. 2 paint manufacturers that want you to wipe out potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in legal obligations could send the issue to voters. Sherwin-Williams and ConAgra could have enough signatures today to put their initiative on California's November ballot. The manufacturers want to dedicate taxpayer money to remove lead paint from homes and schools. The measure would undo a court ruling that holds them accountable for selling toxic paint. John Blackstone has more.
When Brandy and Joseph Glazier purchased their Fairfield, California home 4 years ago, it seemed like the perfect place to raise their 3 children. A year after moving in, their youngest son, Andrew, went to the doctor for a routine checkup.
They called me and said he had elevated lead levels. We were like, what do you mean? Like, how is that possible?
The Glaziers found out that old lead-based paint in the home, built in 1927, was contaminating much of the house.
Well, the windowsill tested positive for lead paint. And he was just sitting there watching for Daddy and got sick.
The Glaziers said Andrew's lead levels were more than 4 times what's considered elevated.
Was there sort of guilt as a parent? Did you...
Can't even describe it.
Oh, yeah.
Lead poisoning can cause lifelong behavior and learning problems, lower IQ, and slowed growth. It's a problem in older homes that's at the heart of a lawsuit against some of the companies that